with some feelings of dismay and disappointment that I listened to the three main presidential candidates speak in terms of conclusions and generalities about, first of all, how they would guarantee our national security, and secondly, eliminate terrorism. Both Hillary and Obama have clearly stated tables for pulling our troops out of Iraq. On the other side, McCain has announced that if elected, he would be ready to keep our troops for about 100 years, if necessary. But why are all the candidates silent about Afghanistan? None of the candidates has provided us with the kind of analysis that has led them to reach these conclusions about American troop presence in Iraq. Such an analysis would allow us voters to evaluate the candidate's ability to guarantee our national security and eliminate terrorism. Let me explain, if you will, my concerns about this lack of analysis. First and foremost, without demonstrating their understanding of how they reached their prospective troop pullout or stay the course however long positions, I do not feel assured that these candidates possess the background knowledge and evidence to reach their stated positions. That is a debatable question, and I remain ready to be dissuaded by any one or all of them. Permit me to raise with you some of the issues I would like to see all of the candidates deal with to explain their positions on national security and on the war on terrorism. I would like the candidates to acknowledge that the so-called war on terrorism is an unconventional war for which there is no conventional. There is no readily identifiable enemy. There will be no signing of a peace treaty to end the conflict. The rules of international law do not apply. And finally, peace will not return to Iraq from one day to the next. Another issue, in dealing with our recession economy, why aren't the candidates focusing on the $12 billion a month cost of the Iraq war as a major contributor to our current domestic economic problems? In blaming the high cost of oil on these problems, we and they are ignoring the fact that it is the war on terrorism that is driving up the cost of oil. Also, I am waiting for one of the candidates to publicly recognize that there is no U.S. national security without global security. Let me repeat that because it's very important. There is no U.S. national security without global security. Many of our most domestic problems these days have a global impact that requires a global solution. Then there is too little mention or discussion of how a new administration would engage the United Nations, the European Union, and the world community of nations in protecting and encouraging global peace and security and eliminating terrorism. The Bush administration got us into this mess in Iraq and in Afghanistan with little or no discussion with other nations. It was largely a unilateral action on the part of the United States. And none of the candidates has indicated an understanding that our disengagement from these conflicts cannot be accomplished without consultation with other nations and with the United Nations. Then too, why are none of the candidates addressing the need to restore the support, the trust, and commitment of our armed forces at all levels from the bottom to the top? I cannot understand why none of the candidates commented when Admiral William J. Fallon recently left his command and retired from the military as commander of American forces in the Middle East over disagreement with President Bush's politicizing of military involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, politicizing in order to suit President Bush's perception of the struggle. And why haven't Obama and McCain called Hillary to task for, and I use the term advisedly, lying about being under sniper fire in Bosnia and about her role in bringing peace to Northern Ireland? Surely we cannot afford yet another president who lies to the American people. When I ask also, when will any of the three presidential candidates demonstrate their commitment to do something to control, to hold accountable, and to eliminate the abuses and corruption in contract performance by such giant military contractors as Vice President Cheney's Halliburton Company and others? And then where do the candidates stand on the closing of the prison for terrorist detainees at Guantanamo Bay, and on their access to the writ of habeas corpus in accordance with our constitutional guarantees and traditional American respect for the rule of law? As for the closing of Guantanamo, this is really a safe issue for the candidates, for which 5 former American secretaries of state last week, both Democrat and Republican, have expressed their support. I'm talking about Kissinger, James Baker III, Warren Christopher, Madeleine Albright, and Colin Powell. There is also apparently no recognition by the candidates that an Iraqi government created by, protected by, and kept in power by the US government, and now distrusted by and rejected by most Iraqis, no such government will ever be able to unify the country and restore peace. The candidates are all silent on what the possible alternatives to this stumbling block would be. For example, is it the creation of a federalized Iraq broken up into 3 self-governing federal states? Is another alternative breaking Iraq up into 3 sovereign and independent nations? Is it allowing the reemergence of a friendly dictatorship, and we have tolerated this in the past, or is it staying the course that has so far led to failure? Another issue that the candidates have not addressed is, where do they stand on Turkey's unilateral bombings and invasions of Kurdish Iraq, and of the unilateral bombings of supposed terrorist enclaves in the Pakistani borderland on Pakistan territory, against the wishes of the government of Pakistan? Such is the nature of just some of the issues having to do with national security and terrorism that I would like to see all of the candidates address. Both the American people and the 3 main presidential candidates have become much too accustomed to discussing complex global and domestic issues in terms of sound bites. But the trouble with sound bites is that they are very often short on substance and heavy with platitudes and self-serving rhetoric. It is just that substance that I want to hear more of from John McCain, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama. Thank you for your attention.
Well, I want to thank the ambassador because I think, in essence, he brilliantly and very concisely said everything I wanted to say. So it's been a real pleasure. And we're out of here. But I take just extend on the very insightful remarks on the ambassador that the ambassador made. First of all, I must tell you I'm being loved these days because I live in Philadelphia. And so we have all the, the candidates are coming through all over the place, and that's kind of nice. But I think what the ambassador said was quite right in terms of sound bites. The fact of the matter is, Mrs. Robinson would like this. The sound of silence pervades very much the candidates in regards to international affairs. I have shared very, very directly my frustration on the part of all three of them in regards to not substantively, at this stage, enunciating their positions in such a way that we as the public can make much more informed decisions. The fact of the matter is they have not clearly stated their positions at all, and as the ambassador says, it's about time that they did. The fact of the matter is, and with our discussion last week, we had a conference on Iraq which was quite good. One of our speakers, who was quite excellent, said, well, we'll get more discussion after the campaign starts between the Republicans and the Democrats. And that's my frustration. I don't want to wait to then in terms of decision making. I need information now. I'd like to just briefly make a couple of points. I think, as Ambassador Haynes said aptly, we're living in what Admiral Watkins a number of years ago said, a very ambiguous conflict environment. The coherence of the Cold War, and I say that advisedly, gave us a bounce of nuclear terror, gave us a framework in which to operate, although the miscalculations, for example, the Bay of Pigs, could have led to global Armageddon. But we had a framework. We had our doctrine, the Soviet had their doctrine. We had our order of battle, and they had their order of battle. And then, of course, with the end of the Berlin Wall, this arbitrary construct that suppressed many, many demands that were out there was very shortly replaced by the New World Order, which clearly was very quickly the New World Disorder. The fact of the matter is that we're still trying to find our position, and one of the things that deeply troubles me, very, very deeply, is even with the exception, the very profound exception, of course, of Vietnam, there at least was some level of bipartisan consensus in regards to international politics. Not only do we have a very ambiguous, confused international environment, but we have polarization in regards to the respective political parties. I understand fully well a number of the reasons for this, and clearly in regards to the last election, in regards to what got us into the whole Iraq quagmire, helps this polarization and is understandable. But it's time to move beyond that polarization in regards to who is going to be the next president, he or she. And unfortunately, to use another expression from a British play, we tend to look back in anger instead of looking forward in terms of dealing with the kinds of problems that the ambassador has aptly brought to your attention. My major area is in the area of terrorism, and so I'll make some brief comments on that because I think Ambassador Haynes covered the other areas that of great concern to me very handily, so I'll just focus on an aspect of that. The matter is, and I want to emphasize this is more than a construct, is that if tomorrow, if God willing, if tomorrow Iraq would be resolved, which it won't be, and I want to share very directly the ambassador's point of view that we have not had the kind of consistent discussion on what should be done in Iraq, and I would add this, by the Iraqis, in regards to resolving what they face in their own country. If, at the same token, and somehow in regards to Pakistan and Afghanistan, peace were to break out, and I doubt it, we would still have the issue of terrorism. And if, in the intractable nature of the Middle Eastern conflict, particularly in terms of the Israeli-Arab conflict, real negotiations led to some resolution, and one tries to be optimistic, terrorism would stay. Because the fact of the matter is, as I have in my own work, and others have dealt with it, is terrorism is truly international in scope. It used to be, and the ambassador is quite right, we talk about terrorism particularly in terms of unconventional war, especially related going back to the wars of national liberation from 45 on, and moving beyond that. And in those conflicts, for better or for worse, one basically had two approaches. One was the hearts and minds approach, and those two approaches basically were to provide, on one hand, that kind of strength for a government to put down an insurgency, what the military used to call internal defense and development. And the hearts approach was one where, if the guerrillas were the fish that swam in the ocean of the people, to drive down the ocean by engaging in the types of civic action programs to win support of the people for the government. The problem now, in terms of international terrorism, is it's non-territorial. It ignores the arbitrary boundaries of the nation state. Bombings take place, for example, in Madrid, or in England, or of course in the US, and especially increasingly in Europe. But where are the hearts, and where are the minds, and where is the territory? The base of operations for such actions may be in the borderlands, as you well know, between Afghanistan and Pakistan, Afghanistan and Pakistan. They may be grounded in the Middle East. But even beyond that, and this is a profound issue we have to deal with, it's no longer a battle for hearts and minds. It's more complicated than that. In a sense, it's a transcendental battle because it's a battle, in a sense, for hearts and souls. That is, there are those who have used the great tenets of a religion to pursue their own agenda and categorize their justification for violence based on their incorrect assumptions in regards to that religion. I might add that a wide variety of those who are involved in these bombings and so forth are not particularly religious at all, but are recruited in terms of having an identity problem and finding that the concept of jihad may be interpreted in such a way that they can assert themselves against the frustration they feel. So in essence, we're dealing, in a sense, with a global insurgency. And I must be candid on this particular point. I don't particularly agree at all with McCain's 100 years. We had a 100-year war, that was enough. We had a 30-year war, that was enough. But I would say that in regards to terrorism, as the ambassador says, it's a protracted form of conflict. There's not going to be a decisive outcome. It's a question as to how, not simply the U.S., I want to emphasize this, but how the publics at large, will they have the ability to deal with the future threats of terrorism? And I have questions about that. Clearly, particularly in the U.S., but I would say also in the European context and in other areas, the reaction is, after the bombing, right, after the skyjacking, and you all recall 9/11, of course, there is a great heightened awareness in terms of the threat. And then again, it goes on the back burner. You know, it goes on the back burner, and then when there's another incident, we go from underreaction to overreaction. And that deeply troubles me, because when we go to overreaction, we run into the difficulties that we see with the Patriot Act and so forth. If there is another, God forbid, but there will be other incidents, and maybe major incidents, will we overreact and wake up the next day different in a society somewhat different than it is now? I don't think this administration or whoever is the next administration is aptly warned directly that we're dealing with a protracted form of conflict and our center of gravity is public opinion. Beyond that, and here's where the ambassador really hit it right on the numbers, is it is not ours to win or lose. Any response to international terrorism must ultimately be international in context. I think a number of you may have seen the public television show, 2 series on Iraq, which was quite well done. But I go to Europe quite often, and I'm upset when my friends say, "Welcome to old Europe." And they're doing it with a certain degree of sarcasm, because old Europe is on the forefront, the center of gravity of the conflict that we now face. The fact of the matter is, and I want to emphasize this point, with the radicalization process that is taking place, increasingly among places, it's in Europe where terrorism has really gotten a very, very strong hold and is likely to increase. Ambassador Haynes has to deal with this very much in regards to the Maghreb, in regards to Africa north and south of the Sahara. And ultimately, I must tell you, no matter how much we deal with terrorism, in this case I'll particularly talk about terrorism associated with the interpretation of Islam, Islamic terrorist, all right? I'm not categorizing Islam. The fact of the matter is, ultimately, any in terms of dealing with that will have to be dealt with by the people in the region. And more specifically, and this is a challenge that we can't deal with, the battle for men's hearts and women's hearts and souls will ultimately have to be addressed by those of the particular region and those of the particular religion. Whether they will or will not be able to decouple terrorism from religious belief is something we will have to see. And Lord knows all countries have dealt with religious extremism. It's not the monopoly of one religion. Finally, and I would end on this note, I mentioned it at the earlier conference we have, and I'm going to say it right now. I think the ambassador hit it right on the head. All of these candidates are taking a goddamn free ride. And one of the reasons they're taking a free ride is because people like you and me have not said, could you be more than how the plane landed? You know, or let's have one more debate in regards to the issue of a clergyman. I need to get, and you need to get substance now in regards to where people stand. And I don't have that substance. So I would say to you, and I think this is a very direct issue which has come out very, very well now, we have to insist in substantive discussion in regards to what our policies are right now. Because quite frankly, we could debate whether there's a war on terrorism. And I never lose sleep whether I call it a war or something else. It makes no difference. But if you ask me, do we have policies in regards to terrorism, I would say yes and no. They're great rhetorical policies, but substantively they're not worth the paper they're written on. So you might want to consider, as our candidates go head-to-head, that it is indeed the economy stupid, but it is very much Iraq and beyond stupid because of the relationship between both. A last note, and I'm glad that the ambassador mentioned it. I think we have to really rethink in very direct our national security structure in terms of how it can more effectively deal with the issues we face today. Our military, composed of highly dedicated men and women, is stretched beyond all belief, whether they're National Guard or regulars. And when I consider, for example, in the last course I taught for, and I'll end on this note, for my old university, 70% of my students in that class had been on at least their second tour of duty in Afghanistan or Iraq. And a number of them had been on a third, and some of my students have been on their fourth. Now that's insane. Having said that, your remarks, your comments.
I guess as we approach a new president and administration, what steps do you feel that we can take as a nation who have lost the support of a lot of people internationally? What steps do we now take to get those people not necessarily on our side, but forming a coalition that we can all work together rather than us kind of taking that stance where we boss everybody else around? What is the first step, do you think?
The first step that I would suggest, and I suggested it in my remarks, is consultation with the world community of nations. As I said in my remarks, there is no major issue of national security or terrorism to the United States that does not have an international dimension. In other words, that does not affect the rest of the world. And for us to have the arrogance to think that we can deal with these problems alone is a major strategic mistake.
I could add on another point, twofold. One of the areas which is very significant is not only at the international level, but regional organizations. And clearly the debate right now going on in regards to NATO's changing role, especially at this stage in terms of Afghanistan, is very, very significant. The need for consultation is absolutely vital. I can say, on a positive side of something, that there is a very informal network in terms of my own area, in terms of counterterrorism, where men and women from all kinds of different countries and different ideologies do work together informally, despite the political rhetoric of their respective countries, to deal with the threat. But I would say ultimately, whoever is the next president, within the first whatever amount of time, had better have a very extensive fence-mending trip in Europe, Asia, and Africa. They better be on the road for quite a while, assuming they fix the economy.
This is a domestic, but also an international question. It's agreed that by many that we need to speak to our enemy. We need to empathize with them. Not sympathize, but empathize with them. Recently, it's been known that Iraq has asked for guns to be turned in, and Sauder made it clear that he doesn't want his followers to turn in their guns. As you know, he did ask for the stop fire, which helped our troops a lot, as you know. But how are we communicating with someone like him who has such a following? He refuses to turn in the guns, but yeah, at least he did tell these people to stop shooting at us. How do you think we can talk to him, and have we started talking to him, I guess is my question.
Nobody on our side is talking to them. Nobody is engaging them in dialogue. There is no demonstration on the part of our government that we at least understand. We don't have to agree with, but at least we understand where they're coming from. We understand what led to their becoming such an important, all-important, divisive force in Iraq. And maybe it even begins in, well, it doesn't begin in college. It begins in grade school and middle school. I was talking to a gentleman coming in. We Americans don't understand what's happening around the world today because we don't study world history, much less our own. I'll never forget, I was teaching a course right here at UCF on the Middle East crisis. And I kept referring to the Ottoman Empire. And I saw people looking at me blankly.
Yeah.
And I said, you mean you don't know about the Ottoman Empire, which existed well into the 20th century, which was a factor in World War I, and which the defeat of which gave birth to all these independent nations in the Middle East, and is at the root of many of their problems. But unless you understand history, you're going to repeat the mistakes of history. And that's very important. The other thing that I think is very important, and I stressed this last week when I was here, it is stupid and self-defeating on the part of the American government to break diplomatic relations with countries with which we have difficult relations. Cuba, North Korea. Who do we have to talk to? We can't resolve those differences through negotiations if we have cut off all channels of communications. That was perhaps an effective diplomatic device back in the 18th century, but in the 21st century, get out of here. Come off it, guys.
I would only part on one point. I agree very much with the issue of negotiation and using the diplomatic method. I think we must use it much more. But I think we must also recognize that there are various groups who don't want to negotiate at all. They very, very clearly indicated what their struggle and what their purpose is. They're not in a negotiating mood, they're in a killing mood. You know, not all men and women of goodwill in regards to this situation. And what I'm saying, there are those groups, unfortunately, where negotiation won't work because they don't want to negotiate. But having said that, I think, and here's a point that I think is very, very, very vital, that ultimately, whoever the next administration is, they better get the State Department to be more involved. And I hope they get a Secretary of State who is a Secretary of State and not a cheerleader. So I'll put that out to you. Sorry about that.
Dr. Sloan,
Yes, sir.
in response to your question or your statement about the military going on 3, 4
Yeah.
deployments, individuals, as a veteran of Vietnam,
Yeah.
2 tours,
Oh,
I'm wondering why we have any kind of an age restriction on military fighting soldiers. Why can't men who are in their 50s and 60s put on a uniform and go over there? We don't have the body of people to put in there, so these guys are going in 3, 4, 5 tours. This would be a solution. And there's a body out there.
well, for a start, they've raised the age, if I recall, to 42. Well, let me tell you, you would recall at 42, you're not 18 anymore. Not only physically, you couldn't put up with the BS that you can put up when you're 17. I don't think the age, although, you know, I don't think the age is the factor per se. What concerns me more, all right, are 2 things. One is the standards get lower, right? Here we have a high-tech military, right? And the standards are getting lower. There is clearly a contradiction in that approach. And the second thing I have no, which you'll appreciate being you being a Vietnam veteran. I'm not suggesting going back to the draft, which would be politically impossible. But the fact of the matter is, we're going to continue to have this problem as long as people of draft age, as they were, right, still think this is a private army, you know, in the sense that, you know, let George do it. The fact of the matter is, of course, and this is what the point that you're raising, if we had a draft now, there'd be far more interest in terms of what's happening today in Iraq than there is now. I don't see an easy answer, but I will tell you this, and this is a very, very serious issue, which I don't know how much we could address over here. We do have a breakdown of civil-military relations, particularly in terms of administration, right, that is politicized, the decision-making process, the military process. But part of that I also subscribe, even though I work very closely with them, careerism on the part of various people within the military who could speak up, but are always looking for the 2nd or 3rd or 4th star. So it takes more than one person to do the job. But if you want to enlist, I can work it out for you. Luxembourg has a real requirement now for people of your training, okay?
And Switzerland has no age requirement. And in Switzerland, oddly enough, you take your weapons home with you. No, all kidding aside.
And Israel, it's 55. So here you go.
So you have some choices.
Got some choices.
If I could just dovetail in on that with having served several tours in Vietnam, for you people in the audience here, back when there was a draft, you cycled over 3.5 million men and women through Vietnam on 12-month or 13-month tours in the case of the Marines, the latter case. One of the turning points in the decision that it was time to leave was when the draft began to seriously impact people where you're sitting right now, instead of people in the lower socioeconomic strata of American society. I think to then just piggyback on the concern that both of our presenters have, the dialogue, I think, would be much more substantive and more on point if you all were to be challenged with a letter suggesting that you might like to visit another country. I think we'd have much more serious dialogue on the part of our candidates for the president than we are at this time.
With most of our allies withdrawing their support, at what point do we stop policing the world and kind of withdraw and just protect ourselves? Or do you think we'll find a point in time where we should stop?
I think there's a succinct answer to that question, and that is when the American public gets fed up with our playing that role in a knee-jerk capacity or in a self-serving capacity that is ultimately detrimental to our national interest.
I would add another point on that. I agree totally. It is not our function to be the policeman of the world. But then you get a conundrum. If we cannot be the policeman, we can't be its conscience either. So you have to raise the issue, right? Where can we be involved, all right? Certainly in terms of Darfur and other places we should be. But where we're going to be involved, where we should be involved, right? Two things I think apply. One, we should be invited to go there. And two, it's not we, it clearly should be international. As soon as you see American flag on a U.S. uniform, right, even if it's for the best intents and reasons in a peacekeeping operation, right, people see the American flag, and that's like what? The elephant in the closet. So the issue is we should be involved, but I'd like you to consider in your own right, where should we involve, at what's the limit of the American conscience in regards to involvement, okay?
Should NATO be expanded into more of what Moscow thinks of as its sphere of influence?
I find that question very, very, very interesting, having been among things at the George C. Marshall Center for European Security. So I got to chew on that. I think NATO's role has been remarkably expanded as it stands now, right? And my question would be, I would be very sensitive as to how much more expansion would be advisable, given the understandable concern in terms of Russia, right, where it could now again talk about its near versus far enemies. So I would be very circumspect as far as how much more one could expand it. I'm amazed how far it's been expanded as of now.
And let's recognize that much of the expansion, the potential immediate expansion of NATO, is coming from the former nations of the Soviet bloc. And I wonder how much of their desire to join NATO is rooted in their desire to demonstrate their hard-won independence from Russia. I think a lot of it is.